Migration and integration unit. Sorry for the short delay. I had totally forgotten about the time that we should be starting at 5 o'clock because I was in an interesting conversation with our honored guest for today, Robb Willer, who we are very pleased to have here for the WZB Distinguished Lecture in Sociology, that is. One of the striking characteristics of Robb is that we could have invited him for a variety of distinguished lectures. We could have also, you'll see that in the talk of today, we could also have invited him for the distinguished lecture in political science, actually. He's not even a professor in political science, but is, actually a sort of hardcore mainstream political science topic that he will be talking on. He is a professor of sociology at Stanford University, but also a professor of psychology there and a professor of organizational behavior. But his work, as I said, also speaks to political science, and even we were talking about it just now, evolutionary biology. And in all these fields and journals in these fields, he has published sociology journals like American Journal of Sociology, American Sociological Review, the Annual Review, but also political science journals such as Administrative Science or high-ranking psychology journals such as Political Psychology or the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. He has a PhD from Cornell University, where he did his PhD in 2006 with the title A Status Theory of Collective Action, where he looks at the role of social hierarchies in solving collective action problems, if I summarize my impression of that work very briefly, and worked there, among others, with Michael Macy. I don't know whether was he your supervisor also? Or? Okay. Then he became an associate professor, or maybe it was an assistant professorship in between, I don't know, but he was an associate professor anyway at UCLA at Berkeley before coming to Stanford. He also was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences in Stanford. And his work stretches several disciplines, as I already said, and mainly centers around two topics, I would say. One of them, in his own formulation, is studying forces that bring people together on the one hand, such as morality and altruism, and what divides them on the other, fear, prejudice, something that he will certainly touch upon in his talk today also. And the other topic related to that is on the role of ideology and attitude formation, also in dividing and bringing together people. And just one title from that work, The Social Structure of Political Echo Chambers, which I found a very nice title and a very relevant one. And it's a little bit what you will be talking about today, I think also. Yeah, what else should I say? Maybe the only other thing to mention is that he is also somebody who translates his findings to non-academic audiences and has been a contributor, among other things, to the New York Times and the Washington Post. So that's not bad either, I would say. I'm not going to talk too long, but so today Robb will be talking about the topic Bridging the Divide. Can effective political communication overcome political polarization? And as you can see already here in the picture there, it's about the increasing divide in American politics between what we even in Europe now know as the blue states and the red states, and the increasing polarization of the political landscape in the United States. Something that we Europeans maybe until 5 years ago still regarded as a sort of curious American phenomenon, but I think by now we've come to the conclusion that the same thing is also going on in Europe and also going on in Germany, and that makes your talk today, I think, also very relevant to a European context where we also see an increasing divide between moral universes. I have a project, among other things, with Bernhard, also Michael Zörn and Wolfgang Merkel here on cosmopolitanism and communitarianism as two political ideologies which are on the rise and which polarize politics in Europe, and as we showed also in the United States, to an increasing extent. People with higher and lower education in urban and rural contexts, in East and West Germany, for instance, also increasingly live in different worlds and indeed don't understand each other's or don't even want to understand each other's moral convictions anymore. And I think that is also exacerbated by the role of the internet and social media, which of course make it easier for people to actually just live their lives in their own moral universe and to pick and choose the kind of opinions that they want to hear. So that's really all I want to say about it, just to make clear how interesting and relevant this topic is. So the structure of our session today is as follows. Rob will talk for about 45 minutes. Then we're also happy to have Bernard Wessels from the Democracy Department here at WZB as a discussant. He will talk for about 10 minutes. Then we'll have a reply by Rob to Bernard's comments. And then the floor is open for questions and comments from the audience. So, Rob.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that generous introduction. I will probably fail to live up to it here. But I wanted to say also I'm very honored to be visiting here at WZB and just be in this multidisciplinary environment. My own educational commitment, intellectual commitment is to always doing multidisciplinary work. I think of disciplinary lines as impediments to integrative social theory and rigorous academic research, things we have to overcome if we're gonna do the best work that we can. So for me, being in a place like WZB is like being in heaven. A place that stands for high quality theory, rigorous academic research, and then a careful disrespect for disciplinary boundaries. It's exactly my orientation. So it's a real honor to be here. My talk today is going to be about how to bridge political divides, and I should apologize here at the top that there's going to be an over-focus on the United States. All of this research was conducted in the US, but I'm hoping that I can learn from you all where this research does apply to Germany and to Europe, and how these ideas might be applied with some modification in new settings, or perhaps are just not even true in these settings. We'll find out. So before we talk about ways that polarization could be reduced through modifications of political communication, I think it might be helpful that we're all on the same page about the nature of the problem, at least in the US context. What are the dimensions of political polarization? And it's funny, polarization is one of those academic words that's gotten out into lay discourse, and with that escape from academia, the term has been used, I think, in a kind of imprecise way. And it's helpful to reflect on the fact that there are at least two major dimensions of polarization, which can themselves be subdivided further. Academics, of course, we're going to do that, right? But the two major distinctions, or the major distinction I would say would be between attitudinal and affective polarization. So in general, what people are thinking of, I think, when they talk about polarization is attitudinal polarization. They're thinking about the average extremity of views between people in a given group or a society, and they're also thinking of the extent to which people's views are clustered around poles. To what extent could you anticipate somebody's view on issue X from their view on issue Y? So this is more or less what I think the lay public most often means when they refer to polarization. It's what I usually mean is how far apart are people on average, and also to what extent are people ideologically clustered around two or three sort of coherent ideologies. Because you could imagine a world where people disagree a lot, but then you can't really predict what their view on any other issue would be from their view on one issue. So you and I might agree on some issue and be really far apart from other people, but then on another issue we'll disagree. But in a very high polarized, attitudinally polarized society, you're going to have two or more camps that have coherent ideologies, and also the distance in attitudes between them will be very large. But in the United States, in the American context, this form of polarization, while it has gotten greater, it's increased in recent decades, it's not increased nearly as much as another form of polarization, which we call affective polarization. So affective polarization describes the extent of animosity, anger, prejudice between political groups. And this has been particularly on the rise. One of the most quoted statistics in American political science over the last few years is this finding by my colleague Shanto Iyengar that 40% of Americans report they would be upset if their child married a person who supported the opposing political party, which is a number that's more than 4 times as large as the proportion of people who say that they would be upset if their child married someone of a different race or ethnicity, and is actually comparable to levels of opposition to interracial marriage from the 1960s, which is really striking. It's a level that's higher than any other basis of social division that we measure in this context. You know, abundant research shows that the partisan divide in the United States has affected social relationships. People are less likely to be friends with, romantic partners with, acquaintances with, be socially connected to people who support the other political party. And then there's also this very robust finding of decreasing warmth for the outgroup. So we often in nationally representative surveys will administer feeling thermometers where we ask people, on average, how warm or cold do you feel towards people who support the opposing party? And these are trends, this is just up to 2012, and I promise you it got worse after that. But this is feeling thermometers towards, this is the average warmth towards the Democratic Party amongst Republicans and Democrats in the United States. And as you can see, Democrats don't really feel any warmer towards Democrats than they did in 1978. But then somewhere in the early 90s, there was this kind of beginning of a trend of decreasing warmth amongst Republicans towards Democrats. And you might think, oh, well, the Democrats' perceptions of Republicans has probably been different than that, but it's been the exact same pattern, basically. So if you look at views of Republicans' views of themselves, pretty constant, very warm, and then Democrats have gotten increasingly cold towards Republicans over this period. And again, this isn't even capturing 2016, which was the most bitterly divided election in really any American's memory. So there's a couple things to highlight here. One is that there's a symmetry to this increasing anger and antagonism between the left and the right in the United States. We often, in doing political psychology, find that conservatives and conservatives and liberals will be different in some respects. In this respect, they're not very different. They dislike one another and more over the years. And then the other thing would be that I think is interesting from the perspective of intergroup attitudes research is that you find this increasing coldness or decreasing warmth, however you want to describe it, but no increasing in-group feelings, really. People are holding pretty constant and having warm feelings towards their in-group, but that's not even going up. And that's kind of sad if you think about it, because usually when we think about intergroup conflict, you at least get in-group love when you have out-group hate. But here, that trend isn't even happening. So there's just more hate in the society, So often researchers will describe affective polarization as a manifestation of tribalism, a situation where two groups are locked in a bitter conflict over a perceived zero-sum set of outcomes. And theorists, political scientists, and sociologists have theorized many causes of this rising affective polarization and tribalism in the United States. So people have highlighted, as Ruud pointed out, this sort of self-selection into different media sources. Starting in the late 90s, there became a supply of right-wing media that became very available. Fox News, the television station, AM radio became very, very conservative, and this has been thought to have had a very large influence on increasing polarization. It's also the case that increasingly people are choosing to live in places with like-minded others, politically like-minded others, and then also people are increasingly selecting into social network arrangements, especially online with social media, where they can surround themselves with like-minded others, and people are less likely to befriend people who support different political causes from themselves. Also, what goes along with this is different perceptions of the truth. So it's not just the case that you're exposed to different information because of the different media sources and different peers that you associate with. In the United States, it's also the case that people are extremely motivated to believe facts that are supportive of their prior assumptions and presuppositions, and inclined to hold information that contradicts their assumptions to a much higher evidentiary standard. So this has also been a factor. Even if people did have the same information, there's good reason to think that they would psychologically, that they would cognitively process it quite differently. It's also the case, and I think this is underrated, that increasingly partisanship in the United States has become aligned with other divisions, other bases of intergroup conflict, some of which it's not really socially acceptable to express these bases of intergroup conflict. But now that they've become associated with political ideological difference, it gives some kind of cover for expressing these antagonisms. So these include racial and ethnic divides, the rural-urban divide, religious-secular, education level, immigrant-native. All of these, well, immigrant-native was perhaps already polarized, but politically speaking, but these other bases of group difference and group conflict have become highly associated with partisanship, more so than in the past, and that offers an outlet for, racial antagonism, nativism, anti-religious sentiment or pro-religious sentiment now can be expressed in the socially acceptable context of political conflict. And then something to get to the actual point of my talk today, another propellant, if you will, a catalyst of political polarization is moral polarization. So social psychologists have underscored that conservatives and liberals in the United States not only disagree about politics, but also about the underlying moral values that become attached to politics. So in a sense, you might say that the political divide that's visible on the surface is undergirded by a deeper moral divide that's less visible, but which is nonetheless real. So research on political and moral psychology has advanced a variety of ways to think about morality. And I'm going to present to you one way that political psychologists have thought about morality, which may be familiar to some of you and maybe not to others. And I'm going to explain how it relates to political polarization. So these political psychologists, Jesse Graham and Jonathan Haidt, have proposed the following typology of moral considerations, moral values, what they call moral foundations in their theoretical framework. And I'm going to go through each of these moral considerations briefly and just try to, briefly explain how each one would relate to the way people think about politics. So they talk about people varying in a given society in terms of the extent to which they concern themselves with these different moral values, these different moral categories of thinking. So one is fairness and reciprocity. So people, when they're thinking about a policy or a specific candidate, some people think, to what extent does this promote social justice and equality and procedural justice and what they would consider fairness. Also, protection from harm and care. So to what extent does a candidate or a policy protect vulnerable people from harm and show some sort of care for people who are in need of support? Also, in-group loyalty. To what extent does a policy or an action or a political candidate show loyalty to our in-group or to an in-group that I share and value and consider important? This is often associated with patriotism in the political sphere, or nativism. Authority and respect. So to what extent does a candidate or a policy or an idea show respect to appropriate, legitimate authorities? To what extent is deference being shown to cultural traditions or authoritative leaders? This is often associated with views of the military, but also views of cultural traditions. And then purity and sanctity. And this is kind of the weirdest one of these moral values, I would say. It kind of feels like it's a little bit different, but I'll explain it. So to what extent does a policy or a candidate protect the purity of things that are sacred? To what extent is the sanctity of something protected? And it's often associated with disgust reactions. So people who are very disgusted with abortion or homosexuality, this is often thought of as a purity-based moral reason for taking a specific political position. So what we find in research is that these moral values tend to be held to a greater extent by liberals than by conservatives. Not that conservatives don't also endorse these values, but liberals endorse them more. And then conservatives tend to endorse these moral values more than liberals do. Again, not that liberals don't also use these values to some extent, but conservatives do more. And because of these different moral, values that enter into their respective political ideologies, conversations between these, political groups often don't go anywhere. So, for example, liberals will say, that same-sex marriage is an issue of equality, and then a conservative might say, no, it's an issue of respect for authority, or protecting religious sanctity, and marriage is a religious institution whose purity must be defended or something. And the conversation will not go anywhere because people have very different moral reasons and just rationales for even taking their position. So this is thought to be one of the reasons that conversations on politics are often not very productive. So research on political psychology finds that where moral convictions underlie people's political attitudes, those political attitudes tend to be very, especially strongly held. After all, people's moral values are their most deeply held beliefs, almost by definition. And so when you anchor a political position in those values, almost definitionally, it's going to be very, very strongly held. And related to this, we find that political divides that are based on moral conviction tend to be uniquely difficult to address. This is believed to be a result of what they have called, what Pete Ditto has called moral empathy gaps. So because we have such strong commitments to our moral values, we find it very hard to understand and take the perspective of someone who has very different moral values. And we may also not be particularly motivated to take their perspective either. We think, these are my moral values, this is the definition of what I think of as right and wrong, and if somebody doesn't get that, they're just wrong. In fact, they might be a very bad person. And why should I take the perspective of someone who has bad values, who does things that I think of as wrong? I mean, after all, people's moral values, people are willing to fight and die for their values, right? And so why would you take the time to think about somebody who's got that all wrong, that's thinking from a completely different moral lens about politics? It's more likely to lead to conflict than to understanding. So some implications of our political divides being undergirded by moral divides, well, it's, at least on the surface, very bad news. And bad news for really, I would say, everybody. It's very bad news for bipartisans who would like to see people come together across political boundaries in order to make government do something to address social problems, because, it's not only the case that people don't see the world the same way, but if you've started to stake out that we're the good people and these are the bad people, then it becomes extremely difficult to collaborate with them, because then you're in collaboration with the bad people and you risk being voted out of office. But it's also the case that it's bad news for partisans. It's not just people who want everybody to come together. Even if you have a very specific agenda, you may be very radical on the left or on the right, it's still bad news that political divides are undergirded by moral divides because you'd like to pass your agenda. In fact, it might be that people with a strong partisan perspective are the ones that are most affected by this, because it makes it extremely difficult to pass any portion of that agenda. Okay, but what I and my co-author Matthew Feinberg were thinking a few years ago when we started doing this research on this topic was that maybe the tight link between morality and politics isn't only a barrier to political coalition formation. Maybe it also can be part of a solution. Maybe it isn't necessarily just the case that link, the fact that we tend to moor our political attitudes and our deeply held moral values, maybe that isn't only a gulf that separates us. Maybe it could also be a sort of a bridge for forming political coalitions. And the specific technique that we began thinking about and doing research on, which I'm going to talk to you about, was this technique of moral reframing, which is essentially the idea that you can reframe a political position to be consistent with your audience's moral values, thinking of a new reason for why someone could hold a given political position that you're advocating for, and that reframed political position should be more persuasive to an audience, that doesn't currently agree with you. And to make this clear, I'm going to go through several examples of this idea and see if I can convince you that this could work. But in order to do those examples, I have to talk to you about the first project that we worked on relating to this idea. So we started doing research a few years ago on political polarization around environmental issues. And we were attracted to this because if you think about it, the environment, which tends to be aligned left-right in most cultural contexts, but is strongly politically polarized in the US context, that it's not necessary that the environment would have to be so strongly politically polarized, that environmental protection issues would have to be the purview of the left and never the right. In fact, I have this secret theory which could never be actually tested, best kind of theory to have, because then you don't ever have to revise it. That if you reran the 20th century in the US 10 times, that 2 or 3 times, 1 or 2 times, the environment would be polarized the other way. Because I think that if you look at the subjective relationship between values and environmental policy, I mean, it really could go a different way. Like if you go back to the 1890s in the United States, the environmental protection, the nascent version of that movement was associated with conservation and hunters and people who wanted to preserve the land because of this kind of patriotism and also shooting animals sort of purposes. And there was a real way that could have been the outlet for environmentalism in the US. And then as recently as the early 70s, Richard Nixon founded the Environmental Protection Agency. So I think there's a possibility this could have gone a different way. So we got very interested in this, and in doing our research on why it is that liberals tend to be more concerned with protecting the environment than conservatives, we found that part of the liberal conservative gap on environmental attitudes could be understood or seem to be driven by the extent to which people moralize environmental issues. So when we studied environmental attitudes, we didn't find that conservatives are anti-environment. Conservatives don't support just decimating forests for no reason in the US. That's like a parody of the conservative position. They're sort of on average moderately supportive of environmental protection, but very unwilling to have any sort of economic trade-offs for those positions. On the other hand, liberals really profoundly moralize environmental protection. And so so for example, we find that liberals are more likely to pass moral judgment on people who don't recycle. And conservatives, will say you should recycle, but if somebody didn't recycle, it doesn't make them a bad person. But liberals would be like, no, you should recycle. It's bad not to. So it's more of a moralization gap than anything. And so we became interested in, why would this be the case? And then if that's the case, could that moralization be changed in some way, that link between the morality of environmental issues and people's positions on them? But so we had this idea that maybe one of the reasons that liberals tend to endorse environmental protection much more than conservatives is that rhetoric around environmental protection is overwhelmingly in terms of more liberal moral values. I mean, even the way I'm talking about it now, right? Environmental protection is, just cuts right to the heart of the harm care moral value, which tends to be held more by liberals than by conservatives. So just to test this idea, we coded op-eds in support of environmental protection, for lack of a better word, that appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today over a 3-year period. And we had people that were blind to our hypotheses, unaware of what we were thinking, code these, and they found that these more liberal moral foundations were more commonly represented in media arguments for environmental protection. And then we also coded public service announcements by environmental organizations and found a similar pattern where environmental organizations promoted their cause in terms of, more than anything else, in terms of this more liberal moral value. So this is interesting, we thought, that given that the arguments that people have heard for environmental protection have been overwhelmingly the kind that we would predict would resonate more with liberals, then maybe we could reduce the political polarization on environmental issues by presenting a new form of an argument that connects conservative moral values to environmental protection. And this seemed like a good test of this idea that that morality undergirds people's political positions. So what we did was we created environmental arguments that were either articulated in terms of liberal moral values or conservative moral values, and we also compared to a control condition that wasn't even a political argument. And we recruited an internet sample to be in this study. And here's the harm message, the harm care message. And this is one that should sound pretty familiar to you. We designed it to look like the kinds of messages that we might encounter on a regular basis. So it showed pictures like this of devastated ecosystems that have been harmed. And it said, dumping of waste and chemicals into our lakes and seas has resulted in the deaths of billions of fish and other sea life. The result is barren soil across the world, making it harder to produce food, resulting in famine and starvation. So we base this on actual environmental messages that we found in our op-ed coding. And then to see if we could perhaps persuade conservatives to support environmental protection more, we created a very different kind of message. So this message said, it is important that we protect our natural habitats from desecration and pollution. Keeping our forests, drinking water, and skies pure is of vital importance. Chemical particles end up everywhere in our food, in our skin, and inside our lungs. Dirty, polluted air actually enters our bodies and becomes a part of us. So it was really designed to trigger a disgust reaction. We showed people this insane picture of someone drinking dirty water. Don't do that at home. And then this gross air polluted city and so on. It really tried to ratchet up this sense that pollution is disgusting and impurifying. So here is levels of support for environmental protection that were reported by liberals and conservatives in these three different conditions. And what we found was that, in our control condition, you have the baseline that, this kind of normal level of difference in support for environmental protection. It's smaller than people think it is, and that's true in the research in general. Then when we presented the harm message, it didn't change very much, but for those subjects that read this purity message, there was a great reduction in the degree of polarization of pro-environmental attitudes. So it was the case that conservatives supported environmental protection more when shown this purity message relative to either of these other two conditions. And then I think maybe more interesting, it reduced to insignificance the differences between liberals and conservatives. So obviously there's very robust differences between liberals and conservatives in these two conditions, but then in the purity messaging condition, that difference was not statistically significant. We also asked people about environmental policy. Here the results were a little bit weaker. We didn't find as strong of effects of the purity message on support for environmental policies, perhaps in part because these policies are very much associated with the Democratic Party in the United States. And we asked about policies people are familiar with. And so here we found a weaker effect here, but still a pretty significant, relative to the best available treatment, you might say, significantly better effect than this harm care argument. And here also it did reduce the liberal-conservative difference in support for progressive environmental policies to insignificance. And then finally, we threw this in, a measure of concern about global warming, which we kind of did just sort of because we were surveying people on environmental attitudes. We didn't necessarily expect much of an effect here, in part because of the message. Neither message even mentioned global warming. That's just a related environmental issue. But nonetheless, we did find that conservatives reported significantly greater concern about global warming. Again, not mentioned in the articles in the purity condition. Although it's worth noting this did not eliminate the liberal-conservative difference on concern about global warming, but it increased conservatives' view of it, or concern about global warming relative to other messages. So this was some sort of initial evidence, we thought, that the sort of subjective connection between people's moral values and their politics can, in some cases, be realigned or reimagined in such a way that political persuasion is possible, even with a highly polarized issue and in a highly polarized society. But it's just one demonstration, so we wanted to do more research on this. And it's also in some ways could be a somewhat easier demonstration than others might be, in the sense that, as I said before, the environment is a moralized issue for liberals, but not so much for conservatives. It might be more, a tougher test to take on an issue where liberals and conservatives both have moral bases for their respective positions on the issue. So that's what we wanted to do in the future studies. So, so to apply this more generally, we just started going through a few issues. Several issues now. We've done something like 7 or 8 experiments on this now, or 6 or 7 experiments on this. I'm just going to present 3 here, and I'll do it pretty quickly so as not to lose your attention. So here we wanted to see if we could persuade conservatives to be more supportive of same-sex marriage. This was done about 4 years ago. It's a very divisive issue at the time, before a significant Supreme Court ruling that may have changed the topography of attitudes a bit. Well, there's controversy over that, but we'll leave that aside. So we've got kind of a system here, right? So the system is, you've got a political position, you identify who isn't persuaded on that position, think about what would their moral values be, the values they endorse more than the other side, and then figure out one that you can make a logical connection to the political position you're advocating for. You can't necessarily make one for every combination of moral value and political position. It's not that subjective connection is not that malleable that you can just always make an argument. So for same-sex marriage, we said, okay, we think we can make a compelling in-group loyalty based argument. And so this is what we did. So we ran this experiment, very similar to the last one, and we either presented people with a conventional equality and fairness-based argument for same-sex marriage, which is the dominant reason we find that liberals support same-sex marriage. And so this message said things like, gay couples deserve the right to get married. The law requires that all citizens be treated equally and have the same opportunities to pursue happiness. Legalizing same-sex marriage is the only fair course of action in a country founded on the principle of equality. Or we made this very different, new kind of message for same-sex marriage based on mostly patriotism. So it said, same-sex couples are proud and patriotic Americans. They share the same basic hopes and desires as all Americans. Like other proud Americans, gay couples peacefully build lives together, buy homes, and contribute to the American economy and society. And America, and America, and America, and America. Yeah. So that's a theme you may find in this message. And here's what we found. Here we break out moderates in these graphs so you can see them separate from the rest of the subjects. And so here we found that conservatives, when shown the in-group loyalty message, reported greater support for same-sex marriage than if they were shown this fairness message, the more typical message. But it had no effect on moderates' views or liberals' views, which is kind of interesting. We would say that that's for different reasons, that liberals are so on board for same-sex marriage that hearing a new kind of argument for it wouldn't lead them to oppose it. And then for moderates, we would say that they don't have a strong moral signature to their politics, and so they probably don't endorse in-group loyalty as much as conservatives do. Basically, this message is constructed to resonate with conservatives, for whom we have some sense of what their moral values might be, and we fit the message to fit those values. Okay, so let's do more issues. Okay, so national health insurance. Huge issue at the time in the United States. It is now again, and I forgot about that. So, but it was particularly charged after the election of Barack Obama and the passage of the Affordable Care Act, because everybody's views of Barack Obama end up getting connected to their views of national health insurance in the U.S. So here we go through these and we say, okay, well, which one of these do we think we can make, a reasonable or an understandable argument, a legible argument for national health insurance with? And so here we thought purity, sanctity, and so I'll show you the message we came up with. But first, this is the kind of the conventional moral reasons for why liberals support national health insurance. It's mostly in terms of equality and fairness. So all individuals have an equal right to health care. Lack of health care coverage is inherently unfair and unjust. Health care is a basic human right. So we showed people a message constructed with this sort of reasoning in it. And then we compared the effect of that to this new, very different message. Might even strike you as strange. It is disgusting and impure to have sick people going around untreated. Having uninsured Americans increases the number of unclean, infected, and diseased Americans. universal health care as a way of purifying America. I'm not saying that these are practically applicable messages necessarily, but test of concept. So here we found the same pattern of results. Basically, it didn't matter what the argument was for liberals or moderates. They supported universal health care as much at the same levels. And then conservatives supported it significantly more, although the interaction was significant and just among conservatives was marginally significant. So we'll take that as some evidence. And then we also asked people about their specific views of the Affordable Care Act. And you might expect that this would be harder to move because Americans are particularly polarized on this. And in general, we kind of expect weaker effects for specific policies than for sort of abstract attitudes. But we found pretty much this exact same pattern. We asked people about the Affordable Care Act specifically. So you might be noticing that we haven't looked at persuading liberals on any political positions, but the logic of the idea would apply equally as well to liberals as conservatives. So we have run a couple studies trying to persuade liberals to support conservative political positions. And so here, military spending is a pretty polarized issue in the US, not as much as same-sex marriage and national health insurance, but pretty polarized, with liberals opposing high levels of military spending, conservatives strongly supporting that. And so we sought to make a new kind of argument for military spending in terms of fairness and reciprocity. So we showed people either this pretty typical argument for high levels of military spending that was in terms of respect for authority and patriotism. It said, we must take pride in our military. The military unifies us both at home and abroad. The military makes us the greatest superpower the world has ever seen. We got a little carried away with that last one. And then we compared it to this new kind of argument, very different kind of argument, that said, through the military, the disadvantaged and the poor can achieve equal standing in society. Being in the military means having a reliable salary and a future apart from the challenges of poverty and inequality. So we sort of pitched like, hey, in the military, it's actually colorblind and blind to your social origin, and it's just, who does military things best. And so you can see I have not had military service, or else I would have a more intelligent articulation of the position. So here we find more or less the same pattern again, that liberals show increased support for this political position in the fairness condition. And then we also asked people the extent to which they perceived high levels of military spending as promoting fairness and equality in society. And we would expect that liberals would move on this. We might have expected conservatives and moderates to move as well. There's no reason they shouldn't move, but they didn't in this study. But the main thing we wanted to see was that liberals would show increasingly think of this issue as relating to social fairness. And then, I'm not showing this here, but there was a mediation analysis that showed that liberals' responses to this item drove their responses to this item. So it was, statistically, we find evidence that it's the case that liberals supported high levels of military spending more because they came to view it as a way to promote fairness in society. So you might be wondering, how significant are these effects? I mean, I've told you they're statistically significant, but are they substantively significant? And I don't know, it's sort of like, sort of in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. I've just put up the last three. The environment one actually had bigger effect sizes than these three. But I've just put these up here, and you can sort of look at this yourself and say whether that's a large effect or a small effect. I can say in the context of experimental research on political attitudes, these are pretty large, but then they couldn't get much smaller and still be statistically significant. So, they're of moderate size, I would say. And, one reaction you might reasonably have is, it seems really intuitive, right? Like, it seems kind of obvious that if you want to make a persuasive argument to somebody, you should explain why they should adopt the position that you're advocating for, right? So, like, if you're having a conversation with your socialist or arch-conservative uncle, at a family gathering, and you're trying to persuade him, it's always the uncle, it's always the example in America. I don't know if it's here. But you're trying to persuade him. If you are trying to get him to not only change his view on some political position, but also change his underlying values, it's just not going to go very far, And so, this might seem very obvious. Yeah, be a salesperson, I guess, like explain why that person wants to own that car. And so it seems quite clear. But in our research, we find that while it might seem intuitive, when it's laid out this way, we don't act like it's intuitive. The way most people anyway, typically approach political persuasion is to explain their own reasons for their political positions. Politics and morality are so deeply intertwined that when we think, I've got to explain to this person why I support this political position. We don't think, well, what's the argument that connects the things that this person really cares about to the position that I'm advocating for? We just don't think that way intuitively. So just to try to test this, we had this idea that maybe people don't find this so intuitive. So we ran a study where we had liberals make pro-same-sex marriage arguments to conservatives, and we encouraged them to be persuasive, and to increase that motivation, we told them we'd give them a cash prize if their essay was like successful at persuading conservatives. And then we had people code the contents of these essays to see, well, what did they do when they really tried to persuade conservatives? And we found that 74% of people made arguments that used liberal moral values, but just 9% made arguments that invoked conservative moral values. So liberals speaking in liberal moral language rather than conservative moral language. And then we found conservatives weren't much better either. They were not much more skilled at this exercise. We had conservatives make arguments for why English should be the official language of the United States, which is a conservative position in the US. That's gotten some attention. And we found that 70%, that's mislabeled. 70% used conservative moral values, not liberal ones, and then 8% used liberal moral values. So pretty much the exact same pattern. People overwhelmingly are making arguments in terms of their own moral calculus, not those on the other side. So you might wonder, why is this? Why don't people do this? Because when I explain it, it sounds intuitive, but then when we look at what people actually do, they don't do it. And I think that this is actually a very interesting pattern that could be explained by a great number of factors. So one is it could be just simply we don't get it. We don't know that a different kind of argument could be more persuasive to people that disagree with us politically. Another one is we might know it, but we don't know how to make them. And we don't know how to do it, and I can say from my own experience making these messages that it is not actually intuitive or easy to make them, you have to really get into the headspace of, somebody who doesn't have your moral values and doesn't have your political positions. And so it's actually quite difficult. And another one is that I think is maybe really interesting is a motivational explanation. It could be like, we could do it. We do know it would be better. We don't want to do it. We don't want to do it. And then that could be itself explained a couple different ways. It could be that we find it, morally, wrong to validate moral values that we personally disagree with. And I think that may be part of it. Another possibility is we want people not just to agree with us on the politics, but also on the underlying moral values. And, this isn't necessarily an unreasonable position. It could be that your position on same-sex marriage is just one instantiation of a larger set of issues that are all connected by a deep abiding commitment to a more just, more equal society. And that it doesn't do you a lot of good to only win the one position if it isn't a part of the larger commitment. And so, I think, people's politics are, they're their politics. So, I'm not here to pass judgment on any of these things. But we were interested in trying to get a little bit of purchase, a little bit of understanding on which of these issues might best explain our pattern that we found where liberals and conservatives did not intuit or did not spontaneously make the kinds of arguments that we found were more effective. So one thing we did was try to see, do people know that the reframed arguments would be probably more effective? So we presented people with military and same-sex marriage arguments that were either reframed or not reframed. So the same ones that we had already tested in these earlier experiments, and asked them which of these would be more persuasive in a study we ran. And we found that 64% of liberals said that the reframed one would be more persuasive. And then 85% of conservatives said that the reframed one would be more persuasive. And in both cases, these are the exact essays we used in the earlier studies. So that explains some of it. Some of it is that 36% of liberals in this study anyway, 15% of conservatives in this study didn't recognize that, a certain kind of, that a reframed argument would be more effective. But another thing that was kind of interesting is that we also asked people would you use this argument? Like, you can send either of these two arguments now, and we'll give you the cash prize if you successfully persuade a conservative. So take that into account in deciding which one you want to send to a conservative. And this is a percentage that's based only on the 64% of liberals who correctly identified that the reframe message would be more effective. 20% of them said, I still don't want to send it. I don't want to send the message that I have told you I think is more effective, perhaps because of this sort of not wanting to win the moral as well as the political conflict. And then conservatives were more pragmatic. They, just 6% of them refused to send the liberal reframed argument to liberals, the one that would likely be more persuasive. So this is sort of an interesting pattern. But this doesn't explain it all. So there's still a fair amount of space here for what I think might be the biggest explanation, which is that we may have some sense it would work, and we might be willing to make these kinds of arguments, but we don't know how. It is difficult, it's not intuitive, you haven't lived inside another moral worldview, or maybe you've had some sort of transformative experience in your life, in which case you're probably better at this than I am. But for most of us, we've had one moral worldview and more or less one political worldview for most of our lives, and we just can't get out in order to understand what would be persuasive to somebody else. So just to highlight a couple things that we're still working on, we have, well, this is not something we did, but the Analyst Institute is a progressive research nonprofit in the United States, and they did a large-scale field experiment in October of 2016 targeting swing states in the US with direct mailings that were either morally reframed or not morally reframed. It was a very large study, and it's proprietary data, so I can't talk in much detail about it, but it found suggestive evidence that conservatives were more persuaded by morally reframed direct mailings. I wish I could tell you more about it, but I can't. And we're working now on a field experiment trying to apply this same research to canvassers, so door-to-door, people who go door-to-door and try to create political conversations to move people in support of certain political positions. And this is just starting now, so we're going back and forth with canvassers. I just got new information from our canvassers in my email inbox this morning, their newest reactions. And so far, it's not going very well. No, it's going okay. But they're finding that morally reframed arguments are effective for a moral reframe type approach, targeting the moral values of, in this case, conservatives for persuasion on political candidates in congressional races is good for creating a positive conversation that's not divisive but is positive, and they're finding that it's leading to a lot of positive conversations, but so far we have not hit upon a recipe that will create much persuasion. So we'll be iterating on that, see if we can get there. So a couple conclusions I want to make, and then I'll exit the stage so you can hear some robust analysis of these ideas. One thing that I think is sort of attractive about this technique is that it is an alternative to the dominant approach to creating political consensus, which is compromise. Compromise on the issues. Like, you want to bring people together, you have to move to the middle. And that, if you have strong feelings on either the left or the right, that's a pretty unsatisfactory technique to be the only technique you can use to increase your share of the vote. Now, maybe that's an appropriate one sometimes, I don't know, whatever, For moderates, it's terrific because in general people are moving towards them. But if you have a strong opinion on a certain political issue, the idea that you could not compromise on the policy position, but just change the available reasons to support it could be potentially attractive to strong-minded people that are nonetheless pragmatic. But what we find in this research, and also on some research I won't have time to talk about today on protest tactics, is that political perspective taking is just really hard. It's really hard. It's pragmatic and effective, but it's difficult. It's not intuitive. It's very hard to understand the perspective of someone who thinks differently about these sort of foundational beliefs. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, so don't get interested in this. I'm skipping it so fast you're not interested. Okay. All right. So just one final concluding point. So this research finds that effective political communication requires perspective taking. It's something we've also found in our research on social activism tactics, that when people adopt more extreme activist tactics, including violence or extreme or very counter-normative disruption of the social order, that those tactics tend to reduce support for the positions that they're advocating for, where more moderate tactics do not have that approach. And what we find is that when we survey activists to try to see, well, why is it people use these tactics if they tend to actually make things harder for them in terms of political persuasion, we find that they don't perceive that trade-off at all. They perceive that more extreme activist tactics will be effective at changing people's minds. And you might wonder, well, why is that? Well, it matches their own internal sentiments. And that's not because activists are weird. Like, we all take our own internal moral commitments to the political sphere. It's a place where we hash out collectively like what's right and what's wrong in these specific instantiations of these candidates and these policies. And so it's entirely intuitive to bring the passion and emotion of morality and moral conflict to political conflict. Totally sensible. But what we hope to show is that a political communication that carefully considers the person that you're speaking with and what would be most persuasive to them can be more effective. And then I guess an important thing to note finally is this moral caveats. If you look throughout history, you'll see countless examples of some of the worst events in human history being made possible by moral political argumentation. Like, there is nothing inherently clean or virtuous about making a moral argument, strategically making a moral argument for a given political position. And there's nothing exclusive to either conservative or liberal values if you do a historical analysis. I mean, you can look at the Khmer Rouge to see, or Stalinist Russia to see examples of genocide being perpetrated because of equality as a moral value. And we can all think of purity-based reasons and nationalist reasons for terrible acts. So there's this technique, we tend to find that it's effective, but there is nothing about it that's inherently good. It's only as good as whatever you use it for, which I guess is sort of obvious, but important caveat because I do think that it can be effective. But to apologize for it slightly, I would say that an approach to politics that involves at least considering the perspective and the commitments of the people who disagree with you involves a sort of basic kind of minimal respect, the respect of taking the time to think about their perspective. You don't have to care about them, don't have to agree with them, but just consider it long enough to proceed pragmatically and effectively. That might be the most kind of basic respect that we would owe our fellow citizens in a given society. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Yeah, thank you. In particular, you, Rob. This was a very, very fascinating talk for at least 3 reasons. And now I have to add a 4th one. That was your argument at the very end, which I regard as a trick, but I will come back to that. Why 3 aspects? One is, of course, the way how you present it. That is always fascinating to see people being trained in the United States presenting, because they do it most of the time much better than we do it on average. Okay, but there are 2 topics which relate to problems we have in research and we have in society. So I'm an electoral researcher, and as such, I'm very much interested in what can we do with emotions. For several years, we now have the problem to measure emotions in our election studies and to somehow find out what kind of effects it has. And I think you have contributed quite a lot to that. And then, regarding societies, we face not the same problem as you in the United States with polarization, but more or less in all European societies, we now face the situation that we also have a strong split neo-populist movements or parties and the more or less traditional parties. We now have a right-wing populist party in our national parliament, and the established parties and politicians all have their difficulties to communicate with the party representatives of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, and also with their voters. Now, what can we learn from your research and presentation? What I find quite reassuring for me as a researcher on attitudes and behavior is that your research confirms that generalized orientations like moral values shape the way in which we view the world, judge the world, and also act. In research on electoral behavior, we have this seminal book, The American Voter of 1960, where we have the funnel of causality. And this basically is the, let's say, simple-minded way electoral researchers think about causality between values, attitudes, and action. More or less, you have factors which come from socialization. They are assumed to be built in the individual's in formative years, and then they are more or less persistent over the life, or the whole life, and they shape basically how we look to particular issues, how we judge them, what is good, what is bad, and then take our action. Okay, so your research basically confirms that there is this relationship between values or moral convictions and how people then judge or evaluate the world. Then you have the results that moral convictions shape political attitudes, and that in the persuasion process, individuals will almost always employ moral arguments that reflect their own. That was what you presented in the second part, rather than the counterparts, moral values. And you have produced evidence that the simple assumption of electoral researchers thus is not too far from reality, because we assume that there is not too much to do against what people's conviction is. So now, taking your framing hypothesis and respective results, it seems to be obvious that framing matters. So obviously we can do something. Using one of the core moral values of conservatives, namely purity and sanctity, for framing a liberal issue like universal healthcare, convinces them more than using fairness arguments for the same issue you showed, and you have done it for same-sex marriage, English language, military spending, and other issues. The theoretical insights for me are very clear and important. For one, your claim that moral values causally influence political attitudes is supported. Secondly, your results support the idea of efficacy in moral and rhetoric framing. But how can we translate that in praxis of communication with our respective political opponents? You brought some arguments what could be the difficulties on the side of individuals. I think it's very hard to find an ordinary citizen who is able to learn about different value worlds and find it applicable in her or his own argumentation. And that is one. And the second, even if that would be the case, it would probably produce too much cognitive dissonance for the individual to do that. And some of your results, if Democrats say that, or liberals say that 20% of them say they would never apply it, basically is a defense probably against a cognitive dissonance. For political entrepreneurs, the situation may be different, because first of all, they have either the apparatus to produce the knowledge, or they have it themselves, and they may be able to reframe issues or own issues in a way that suggests the yardstick to evaluate the issue come from a different and their own world of values. But for me, a second problem comes in, and that is a problem of credibility and integrity. Because what we learn from electoral research, politicians are always, if you look to personality traits, what is most important, then it is integrity and credibility, and then leadership, and so on and so on. And we know also that parties cannot move too far from their identities. Of course, the politicians would be able to do that, but the voters would not accept that. So then you have the problem if somebody takes a different view, a different ideological argument, would you believe him or her if you know that that is the wrong argument from that person? I doubt whether that would work. So I see quite some difficulties in making practical use of results to decrease polarization and fight. The yardsticks about good and bad are embedded in individuals and probably hardly can change. However, I have the feeling from your article and from what you presented that emotions play and intuition plays a core role for what you found. If I translate that into my understanding of what that could be, then basically emotion for me is something like a signal for salience of a problem. Intuition is a generalized yardstick of good and bad. I doubt that one can influence intuition, but I see that one can work on salience, or at least I hope. In the German case, we have had the situation with the Alternative for Germany that they very much emotionalized the campaign. It was not so much in terms of moral values, although there was also this more or less in-group, out-group. That was kind of a moral argument. The other was more fear. So fears as the emotions. And if one knows how one can influence the emotions, the salience, so to say, of the yardsticks, maybe then we have a handle which could practically work without running into either a cognitive dissonance or in a situation where people don't believe what you try to convince them. Maybe that is one of your difficulties in the experiment you reported about, that you basically have a better communication, but you cannot convince the people. I don't know. So from a perspective of attitude theory and from a practical point of view, it would be interesting to know if you see that there are possibilities to reduce emotionality in order to get rid of certain problems in the discussion between opponents. That would be helpful. And in general, how much role emotion plays, because it was not so clear for me from what I heard, but it's only a feeling that there is a lot in that. And again, I doubt that we can expect individuals to do reframing, because it is too much related to the intuition, which hardly can be changed. Now to the last point. I don't think that one can easily make the argument we should basically pay respect to the others and using the ideology of the others, or putting that basically in the same bowl. That is it's so demanding, and I think even I would have demand, huh? Yeah. Even I would have difficulties to do that, although I think I'm quite firm what ideologies in Germany are concerned, for example. So I think one can take each other serious without taking the position of the others. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, then We'll first give Rob the opportunity to directly reply to Bernard's comments, and then we'll open up the discussion.
All right. Well, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and incisive discussion of this research. I think, I mean, I agree with a bunch of these points about how this is practically very, very difficult to apply. So I'm not gonna contradict all of these points, but I do have some thoughts on them. So just on the practical applicability, we've been trying to connect this research more and more to what it would look like out in the world. So for example, there was a study that was published by a couple of my collaborators on using these techniques to persuade people on views of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016. This is embedded in a survey experiment context, but it's nonetheless about campaigns and candidates rather than isolated issues. And that found more or less the same results that we found in the results in the research that I presented today. And then there is this this progressive nonprofit that I've referred to that found very good effects for direct mailings that used moral reframing, and that these persuasion effects persisted over a significant time period of several months. So this is some sort of suggestive evidence that you could take this to the context of a campaign and find some good effects, or find significant effects. The canvassing study, we're still working on this, and when you're trying to design effective canvassing techniques for door-to-door conversations, like one thing that occurred to me immediately was just what a different encounter it is. Like when you have somebody looking at a piece of direct mail where you can make your argument, or reading a 3-paragraph essay where you can make your argument, you have them like you're holding them hostage, and they have to read what you're saying as part of this encounter. They don't have to read the direct mail, but they can't say anything back to the direct mail. And when somebody knocks on your door, you don't want to have the conversation to begin with. You're probably more interested in explaining your own perspective than hearing somebody else's. And so it's just a completely different persuasion kind of situation. I know I'm getting a little lost in these details, but they're very interesting to me because I've been thinking a lot about them. So if you want to be persuasive, one of the best techniques is something called deep canvassing, which this recent research by David Brockman and Kala found can be effective in this paper published in Science a year and a half ago. And it essentially involves sort of getting the other person to see the logic of your political position. You do less talking, they mostly do the talking, and you sort of direct their thinking in the interaction. And so you prompt them like, well, do you think that this party has acted consistent with your values as you've articulated them? And we're seeing if this could be an effective fusion of two techniques, this deep canvassing and then moral reframing might be effective for these interactions, but it's just a whole different playing field when the person you're talking to is going to do 2/3 of the talking, like maybe more. And it might be that it's not possible, but we are happy that so far we've found that the interactions are at least going well. And so this relates to a couple of the concerns that I think very intelligent concerns you articulated, like does it cause too much dissonance for a persuader, for an advocate for a position? We're finding that the canvassers are coming out of these interactions, happy with these interactions and saying that the interactions were even better than when they went to Democrats' residences to register them to vote, because I think I don't know if research has been done on this, but there's something to be said for the feeling of solidarity between groups that expected to hate one another. Like when you have a positive interaction across lines that you expected to be bases of difference, it can actually be a very, like uniquely positive interaction. So even though we're not finding persuasion yet, people seem to be appreciating these interactions. So, and then likewise, it doesn't seem like we have a credibility or authenticity problem in this local context so far, in the sense that people are like, oh, this is very nice, like a liberal who cares about patriotism, like, let's talk. Okay, we can talk finally. I'm not persuaded by you yet, but, and we're also running another experiment now, not to get too lost in the data, but where we're trying to see if there are ways to reframe progressive economic policies to be more persuasive to conservatives, and we're doing it in the context of candidate evaluations. And there, we're seeing if conservative moral values can, lead conservatives to support progressive economic policies, which they're normally very far away from. And there, in our initial pilot testing, we're getting the same pattern of like people are not willing to move yet when they're asked to whether they would support this candidate that supports these policies, very anathema to conservatives. But they like the person. So we'll find like, you know, in our early pilot testing so far, like people will not be persuaded, but they'll say like, you know, I like this candidate. I would like to have a beer with him. He's, you know, he seems cool. His policies are terrible, and I would never vote for him. But, you know, I like him. You know, I gotta say, like, finally, you guys are talking straight. You know, so I think this suggests that, you know, when you hear an argument that's in terms of your values, you know, it can send a deeply tribal signal, possibly a more deep kind of tribalism than the political divide that you're trying to mitigate. So, and then I think emotion and intuition. I actually think that emotion and intuition are part of why these studies have worked, you know, when they do, is that it you know, you're hearing this moral rhetoric that hits on emotional and intuitive, you know, emotional intuitions that you have that are then being activated in a direction you maybe didn't expect. So in the environmental study where we tried to make people disgusted with pollution, we found that that persuasive effect was mediated by levels of reported disgust. So, you know, a deeply held intuition that's associated with conservatism was harnessed, but to go a different direction. So, but, you know, I think these are practical. I mean, the gulf between a survey experiment and then application in the world is enormous, and we're trying to reduce that gap, you know, but it involves challenging new questions, you know, like the ones we're finding in the canvassing study of like, oh, well, we're gonna have to kind of change this if it's gonna be effective in this new setting. So all of these practical considerations are ones that I agree with, and I agree are unanswered questions. But I do think that authenticity one, I think that we'll add some research on this, or measures of this actually, to our research in light of your comments, because my gut intuition is that they might actually view the person as more authentic, just in the sense that they think of authenticity as just like, do I like this person? You know, like, I mean, maybe that's the way they answer the survey question. But yeah, these are excellent points, and I do think that it is a challenge to apply something like this in the contemporary German context, where the moral divide is so profound, and also some of the available arguments that one might immediately consider making might be just too distasteful to people to make. But I do think that, you know, thinking with a political divide, if you're on the liberal side, like what are religious traditions that I could connect this to? What are religious principles? What are cultural traditions that this could be connected to, a given position could be connected to? Yeah, like cultural traditions, religious values, and promoting what is good about one's country or relevant group. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. There was one thing that burned on my lips listening to you, also having read your earlier work on moral ostracism as a mechanism that promotes group cohesion, makes group collective action, cooperation possible. And thinking about your question, why don't people actually do it? So maybe because they're not aware, whatever, or because they think they cannot advocate the position of or the moral position of the political opponent. Might it be that actually, because what happens here, if you make that kind of arguments, you're a boundary crosser.
Yeah.
You use a different type of moral argument to argue for the same position, or the alternative, you use the same moral argument to argue for a different position. But the tight coupling between issue positions and moral positions is loosened, it's just decoupled in this case. And what tends to happen to people who actually do that decoupling is that they become morally ostracized. Mm-hmm. So could it not be the expectation that actually if you start using conservative values to argue for same-sex marriage, what happens to real people who make these arguments, maybe not in a canvassing situation, these are people who don't know each other, but in the context of a public debate or a discussion in the pub or whatever, that's not going to make you popular. And that might be a reason why it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, I have to agree, since you connected my research to the other stuff. Like very, very cleverly done reframing of your own. I totally agree, and I think we would all agree with that idea that if you find yourself leaving the ideological orthodoxy of whatever, you know, political ideology you subscribe to, that you may find yourself being criticized, especially online where sanctioning and peer criticism is so easy and costless to administer. And worse yet, you may just provide footing for someone else to establish their moral bona fides in their ideological group, because what's a better way to establish, how deeply committed you are to an issue than to criticize someone who's not on the right side of it. So I agree with that, and it's in a lot of ways perhaps unreasonable. Well, I mean, what I would love to say is that it's possible to do this without this drawback happening. And there's a couple ways that could be the case. So one, you can use the logic of segmentation, like when you're talking to a conservative audience or talking to a liberal audience, make the arguments that are persuasive to them, and then when you're, and vice versa. So it doesn't have to be the case that you give the same rationales in every room you're in. You can make arguments that are tailored to the audience you're speaking to, which might sound manipulative, but it's not that different than going to a community and addressing their unique economic concerns. Like that's something we would take as totally acceptable, but for morality, we think of it as maybe not. But I think it can be. I think there could be multiple reasons, moral reasons to hold a given political position. So that's one way. Another way that I think it could be okay is if it's the case that people understand that you are on their side. So for example, say you're a liberal making a conservative framed argument that's intended to be persuasive to conservatives. It's a tricky path, but it could be the case that you could simultaneously signal to liberals like we share a political ideology, and then signal to conservatives like we share a value basis. But I certainly agree, it seems like it could be tricky. I think a good sign is we haven't found any evidence that the morally reframed arguments turn off people that already support the issue, which you might have expected. You might expect liberals to be like, oh, I don't like same-sex marriage so much when it's associated with patriotism, because I'm not strongly associated with patriotism. But instead, what we're finding more is they're like, oh, okay, that's another reason, that's fine, like I'm not against patriotism per se, and so that's fine,
Okay, let's open up the floor for questions from the audience. I think there are microphones somewhere, so first question I saw was over there. Here in the front. Oh yeah. Over there. Yeah.
My name is Stephanie Elis. I work for the largest social democrat political foundation and think and do tank Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And listening to your already reading the headline, how can we overcome polarization? I asked myself, actually, do we have the same concept of polarization? As I think that in Germany, maybe, or in Europe, it is a bit different. Polarization in a not bipolar political system is maybe something good. As we found in the recent elections, that actually a lot of people were scolding the large political parties for not polarizing, actually more trying to harmonize political issues so that they will not be seen as something extreme or something tending towards extremist or right-wing or whatever other or left-wing extremist political positions. So I think that that maybe in a situation where we are in Germany more dependent on actually having a good voter turnout, which is not the same thing in the United States, we have to win people for one by one in a political competition. So actually polarization is something very much needed for mobilization. What is actually not nice about polarization is when it becomes social hedging, or when it leads to segregation, when it leads to racism or extremism or other issues that we don't want to see in our society. But polarization, actually, if it is cleverly done, is nice, But actually, it's not bad. Why do we have to overcome it? And I think that for people who try to do the reframing, and we do a lot of research as well on this with also your colleagues from Berkeley, Wehling and Lakoff, who have been writing about this. And we found that of course it is good to avoid doing it linguistically wrong in a political debate, but actually it also is about the issues, whether you really do something about the issues, whether you actually put politics on the ground. So the framing is, of course, important, and especially the AfD used it very, very cleverly in reframing issues like gender studies or gender equality, in turning it into gender ideology, issues like that. So they do it very cleverly. And we have to deal with it. But on the other hand, I think it's more also about having a narrative that is working and that is actually convicting people that politics will be put into place. And so I think there is something in this, yeah. And last question, oh sorry, I'm a bit long today, but on the methods of empathy that you need to actually step into the other people's minds, yeah. We found it very inspiring to work with design thinking or design-based methods like creating personas, which actually depict the other so that we actually can step into their shoes. It's very valuable for the spin doctors to do this, but they don't do it all over the place.
Can I ask next questions to be a little bit briefer, or just one question maybe, because otherwise other people won't get a chance. But Rob, answer to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a lot of terrific points, and of course you have much more local knowledge than I do. But this should not be seen as any sort of replacement for having the right policies. Like, I mean, that's that. Hopefully that goes without saying. There's a much larger body of evidence that matters, So the evidence for framing, a lot of it inspired by my friend George Lakoff's research, it's newer, and it's clearly the case that having the right positions matters. Then I guess I would say that for the question of motivating individuals and turnout and winning people one by one, I do think that morality is a part of that equation. Probably for several decades, political scientists tried to answer this question of why do people vote? Why do you do it? That your vote won't matter. That no election has been decided by a single vote. I guess except for the 2000 U.S. presidential election, which if you were a Supreme Court justice, you could have actually decided that entire presidential election and the fate of the 21st century in the U.S. But why do you do it? Well, people go to the polls to be good people. People want to go to the poll. They don't, sometimes they go just to vote their interests, I think. But I think the research, political science research, is more consistently showing that they go to promote the well-being of their community, of their families, of their society as they see it. And so tailoring to that, I think, is important. There was at least one other point you had that I wanted to respond to, but okay, yeah.
There will be also opportunity for
good. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So I have Michael Zürn now on the list, and I see two more. And yeah.
So thank you very much. I mean, this was really a very fascinating and really instructive presentation. Thanks. I think the most fascinating move for me was that you essentially translated or handled moral justifications as if they were frames, as if they were cognitive frames. So you essentially argue those moral justifications are things that are easily fungible. You can move them around to different contexts and to different policies and all that. And as a sort of a German political scientist with a little bit of Habermas in my DNA, I wonder about this move of handling moral justifications as frames. And I mean, I would like to ask you in that respect only two questions. I mean, one is also referring to the question, why don't people do it? One possibility that I see why they don't do it is because it is in the political context not successful. You showed your numbers, I mean, with experiments, but I mean, think about an experiment with a, let's say, deliberative mini-public. Is it not the case that if you use the wrong justifications for the right policies or the right justifications for the wrong policies, that essentially this falls apart in a process of deliberation, in a process of exchange of arguments? So it works if you use it as a frame, but if you use it as a sort of a justification in a public deliberation, it may not work to the same extent. So I mean, that is essentially a question, but also a suggestion how to go on with this wonderful work. deliberative mini-publics or something like this. And along the same line, I mean, I think Bernhard raised this issue already and Ruud as well, is there not a danger if you endorse the wrong moral justifications from your point of view, that you essentially weaken yourself in the political debate in the long run? So it's not only a question of cognitive dissonance, not only a question of, I don't want to do this, but also a sort of a rational choice not to weaken your own moral justification in the long run. So, and that is essentially, I think both of those questions refer to the question, is it possible to handle moral justifications as if they were frames?
So I think these are outstanding questions. And I think, so to the first one of, does it work? I mean, we have this empirical research that we're doing and continuing to do, trying to, better demonstrate, when it works, when it doesn't work. I would note that, a lot of really effective political candidates, politicians, seem to do it intuitively, sort of intuiting the right buttons to press for the right audience. And I think that moral reframing, I mean, in a way that makes this all mundane, since it suggests that it's something that the right people already know. But I think it can actually help explain why certain people are more effective politicians than others. And, I think that, I mean, not to dive all the way into social constructionist land, which I think would be, probably not right, but I think for a lot of the political positions that we studied anyway, their moral foundation in the public sphere was somewhat arbitrary. I mean, I think more in gay rights primarily in terms of equality, seems pretty intuitive, but like the environmental stuff. Like I really feel like to some extent the connection between morals and politics there is somewhat an accident of history, and that there could have been a different alignment. And by that reasoning, if it could have been this way, you could also make a credible winning case for another connection between morality and politics. And we don't pay a lot of attention to issues that wind up winning consensus because they exit the political stage, like issues that wind up winning 80-90% either because people with different value bases come to agree, or because there emerges some moral consensus for a political position. But it is the case that sometimes people, do overcome these divides and come to agree. And sometimes they get there through different paths. But then I think your second point is one that is maybe my biggest concern with this technique, which is that maybe you win the battle and lose the war when you do moral reframing. You persuade some people somewhat on this issue, and then you lose a larger moral conflict that exists in society, or you move back a little bit on that one. I think that's very possible, and we can't test that very effectively here with our methods, and so I'm not really going to be able to refute that, but I do want to suggest two rebuttals to that, acknowledging that it's a position I've thought makes a lot of sense. One would be that you still might use this for like huge issues, like national health insurance, immigration policy, who's going to be the president, something like that, where it just changes so much in a society, so much of an effect on welfare that you're kind of like, I don't care if we lose the moral war, 5%, if we can get past 50% on this issue, it might be worth it. And then the second one is that, there's almost as good of social psychological reasoning that would suggest that getting someone on your side on a core issue might make them more likely to adopt another issue that's associated with your side in the future. So like, while I share your intuition that you make a moral argument, you're validating morals that cut against you in the long run, I can also entertain this other idea of like, you get somebody to agree with you on national health insurance, maybe they've never gone that liberal on a political position before, and maybe they're more open to switching on something again in the future. And I just don't know which of those intuitions is right.
Okay, I have already 5 people on my list, so we're going to gather questions now a little bit. So we'll take 3. First I saw you first, and Uli, and then there was somebody in the back, right there. Yeah, exactly. So those 3 we take first.
Just a few words. Thank you for this lecture. I mean, really, I can tell you why, but it will take longer. First of all, it's such a great possibility, a kind of human communication, really, because now young people and older people, they communicate with computers only. I do. I mean, I have all my answers for all potential possible questions from computers. So what I want to say is this, that when you do your next study, please include such criteria or whatever you call it, like age, like access to education, like who will vote in 5 years from now, how much young people actually understand what politics is, and how many times are they being addressed as the future voters for in any political campaign. Because honestly, when you were talking about differences in Europe and in United States, I am total outsider. I'm not from here, from there, but I did study deeply US kind of ecosystem, and now I am 5 years in Berlin, and I can tell you my personal opinion, it's different. I mean, it really is. And now I suggest that you might also want to pay attention or just have a look at what will be going on in Russia when the election will be in 2018. And when talking to your students or to your audience, please always remind them that politicians, they are professionals. They will manipulate you 99.99%. And those young people who will go to vote in 1 year from now, 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, if they vote, they should vote. But also they must remember that they will never regret for what they voted for, you know, because they will be manipulated, but at least that they would be prepared for this. Because if the voting to federal government is being scheduled a few days before or a few days after when the Oktoberfest starts, so you always think, what did these people drink before they go to vote? So it's huge manipulation long before the election starts. Thank you.
Okay, Uli?
Hi, I'm Uli Schreiter. I found your talk and the points you made very intriguing. So, to some extent, they were persuasive, but also bewildering in a number of arguments and perspectives, one of which Merkelson has already pointed out. Now, I got 2 points. First, a question. I was wondering as to if you have any guess or maybe even a proposition why the importance and stability of moral sentiments for political decisions has obviously increased. Does it have to do with a dissolution of political, moral, cultural milieus that we can observe over traditional milieus that we can observe over a long time? Is it a paradox side effect of globalization, or are there any hunches as to why this might have happened? Second point, if your point is taken seriously by policymakers, it's easily to be imagined that we can have a sort of rat race of a new industry of reframing, moral reframing political arguments, and we have a lot of new spin doctors, and we have an arms race in a new sort of production of knowledge, right? So where does it lead us to? Would we need some new regulative authority, a ministry of truth, or any kind of, you know, deliberation point of guaranteeing, safeguarding fair combat in this respect? And second, where does it lead us to in terms of legal court systems, court cases, in particular in a system that has no written constitution, like in the US or in the Commonwealth? Wouldn't it be a nightmare? Okay, I cut out. Thanks.
Yeah, we have to keep these questions really short, because so I really ask for just one, anybody who asks a question from now, only one question and not a set of questions, please. So, yeah, you there.
Hi, Martin Kovac, MCC Berlin. We are doing social science research about sustainability pathways, and we are currently undertaking an even more ambitious project than you have outlined here. I think we share your assumption that many political conflicts are rooted in value issues, that there's a diversity of values, of rather stable value beliefs, and also that adopting each other's viewpoint might help bridging the divide practically. And there's a fourth assumption that you more or less implicitly stated, that maybe all of these different value viewpoints are somehow valuable and reasonable if reframed in a particular manner. And so there's some, it deserves some kind of minimal respect. And so the idea is now like a scenario-based learning for two reasons. First, in some of the problems, values have to change in order to be able to solve a problem. It's not sufficient just to take the given value beliefs, but maybe several groups or all groups have to at least reinterpret their value beliefs in order to find something else than a dirty compromise. And the second thing is that many problems like climate change or others are so complex that maybe the kind of assumptions that you presented to the interviewees are maybe not credible enough, so they need to somehow be embedded and contextualized. And so the idea is, because this is also complicated, to confront people with concrete future worlds. This decision theater, Arizona State University for 20 years already in the water management sector. So my question is, do you have any experience with that, or any advice or any criticism of this approach? Do you think this confronting people with concrete future scenarios based on their respective value beliefs and then trying to find different shades of gray rather than black and white pathways or so, do you think this is promising for your goals and also for even changing value beliefs?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Rob.
So I think I'm very interested in effective environmental messaging, and I've done some research beyond this research on how to do effective environmental messaging. I agree with you that the abstract, distant nature of the potential consequences of climate change makes it extremely difficult to get people to perceive action as being in their interests. It's a huge barrier, and one thing that we found is that coupling, one of the problems is that especially more conservative individuals tend to be averse to believing in or receiving evidence suggestive of massive systemic social problems, that there's a belief in a fundamentally just world that will sort of be stable and work itself out, that's present more among conservatives, that partly drives the reluctance to believe in climate change or take action. And so we find that you can reduce polarization on environmental attitudes not only through this, moral argumentation, but also by emphasizing the potential effectiveness of solutions. And so you can talk about all this stuff that's bad that could happen, but spending a lot of time talking about how the proposed solutions are equal to the problem or sufficient to mitigate the problem, which I realize is very difficult in the case of climate change, but it produces so much cognitive dissonance to just accept that the world is facing this huge calamity, and that you're supposed to change your light bulbs or whatever, and you're like, well, I know that's not going to fix it, and so I'm just going to try my best to not believe this. But if instead there's like a viable solution that's presented, a pathway, people are more likely to admit to the problem in the first place. So that would be one thought.
You want to react to the other questions?
Oh, yes. Okay, cool. Okay, let me try to pull it back. So
you don't have to respond to all individual points, obviously, but you can pick and choose a bit, but at least address.
Okay. So the first question was how to explain increased moralization that seems to exist. So I don't actually know if that's the case. I mean, I don't know of research showing that, though I wouldn't at all be surprised if that was the case, just because of the increased political tribalism in the U.S. and frankly, most of the West. Would suggest deepening moral commitments. And if I had to explain it, it would be that this particular moral values of like equality and group loyalty are triggered by globalization and the mixing of individuals from different religious and ethnic backgrounds that's happened, and obviously in the EU a great deal, but also in the United States. I was talking earlier, Seymour Martin Lipset, a great American political sociologist, he explained the difference between the U.S.'s level of economic progressivism as compared with Canada and Scandinavia was, driven by racial heterogeneity in the working class. And he said, you show me a country that's maintained, a robust welfare state and a powerful labor party, despite having a racially heterogeneous working class. And he's like, if you do, you'll find the first one. And what we're finding, unfortunately, is that as ethnic heterogeneity increases, in countries that didn't have it before. They're wrestling with that, that barrier. How do you establish group identity across these lines? And this is part of why we're doing this research project on moral reframing of progressive economic policy, trying to see, like, could you form a moral basis of commonality where an ethnic one is not available? We'll see.
Okay, 2 final questions. Short, please, both of them, and a short reply by you also. So the 2 ladies in the back, Dilek first.
Thank you. Dilek Kurban, Hertie School of Governance. I have a question based on the 5 moral categories you gave and some of the examples that you discussed. I mean, one could argue that when you talk about environmental protection and military spending, there is a degree of self-interest, right? These are things that affect everybody. In the US, so perhaps it's easier to, for conservatives to be sort of receptive to an alternative way of thinking, one could argue. When it comes to, say, gay marriage, this is, of course, a harder category, but you can also still argue that you could find a relatively more receptive audience for personal reasons, a gay member in the Republican family, or class issue, right? The fact that you have a significant middle class community, and of course the fact that there are gay Republican voters, right? So, but then when you think about the immigration issue, which you didn't, answer, and that's my question. I don't know whether you've tested this on that. The current debate about, the DACA, etc. There, of course, for a Republican, what is the interest, right? Direct, indirect, you don't see it much. And then, of course, there are, when you think about this community, there's the rural-urban divide, they're poor, etc. And I guess it's not coincidence that when you think about the pro-immigration argument, it's actually the dominant voice you hear, not exclusive, is based on conservative values, right? We hear about the tax-paying immigrants who contribute to society, etc. So I would, and this is, based on your presentation, these are, of course, conservative values. Did you make this test based on this issue? If yes or no, I would like to hear your views on that. Thank you.
Yeah, we're working on a project now. Actually.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, well,
okay.
Let's take them together otherwise.
Yeah.
So the lady in green there.
Yeah. Maarja Lühiste, I'm otherwise based in the UK. So I'm thinking of how well does the moral argument work in 2 situations. One is where you have polarizing issue that crosses partisan lines, and the other one is where simply you have an argument in line with your moral values, but you're simply based on misinformation. And what I'm thinking about is Brexit in this case, where you have both in the Labour and Conservative camp people who strongly oppose it and people who strongly support it, and also where you could use, for example, the more conservative side argument of economic progression and stability, but it's used in a way that actually the UK is better off outside of the EU. Thanks.
Wanted to say something very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. Concerning polarization, you made a very important distinction in attitudinal or in positional and affective. And I think the problem is with the affective one. There we also have the problem of increasing emotions in politics. We see it with negative campaigning. And what it does is basically that it does not judge about good and or right and wrong policies, but about good and bad people. So, just a comment.
Okay, final word to you, Rob.
Yeah, oh great. Yeah, these are more very challenging but excellent questions. We haven't yet run an experiment on immigration policy, although we are designing 2 right now, one with Jens Heinmüller, a German political scientist. And what we're gonna try everything, basically, everything that the social psychology and political psychology literatures seem to suggest could work, because I mean it's a particularly difficult one because so many people perceive more open immigration policies as contrary to their self-interest, and so try connecting it to patriotic values. I think that's totally doable. Will it be persuasive? It's hard to say. Connecting it to religious values, connecting it to cultural traditions. Which you can appeal to culture. I mean, no country didn't build itself in part through immigration. And so I think that there are things that one can connect that policy to, but I do think it's one of the more difficult ones. But I think that just making that sterile economic argument, which is the dominant way that Democrats respond in the United States, is incomplete. Because when people feel like they're on the wrong end of the various economic trade-offs, the larger economic growth argument, I just think it's insufficient. And I think we have a lot of international evidence for that. I'm not saying that argument shouldn't be made. If the evidence supports it, it should absolutely be made. But that it could be complemented with a moral argument would be, I think, more effective. And then wow, gosh, what did you say? Okay, sorry. So, yes. Got it. Okay, thank you so much. So I would say that any rhetorical technique should work better where the position is not strongly associated with political ideology, because then people don't have to forsake their political tribe and potentially lose face in the face of fellow partisans. So that should make things easier, those situations, although we haven't studied it, and it would be very interesting too. And then I think you bring up a great point of evidence, like how do you deal with people consuming inaccurate information and having this biased perception of reality? Well, I think that granted, one of the reasons that people consume misinformation is that it's very cleverly produced, and we can do certain regulatory things to try to fix that problem, but it'll be very difficult to completely fix that problem. But what we can do is we can work on the motivational end. People consume fallacious information because it agrees with their deeply held commitments, value commitments, beliefs about the world, political group commitments. And if you can readjust those commitments, make people less motivated to consume information that verifies their prior position on an issue, that could be a counterintuitive way to get people to be more open to more accurate information. Because that bias, if you think about people believing information that they receive as a sort of combined function of like wanting to believe things that are more true, but be loyal to groups and, preserve your self-interest, that's where the bias comes from, is the second and third factors. And so if you can address those, then you may be able to increase the causal influence of truth.
Okay, Rob, thanks for a fascinating talk. Thanks you also, Bernard, and thanks to the audience. There will be drinks outside where we can continue the conversation, and I think also the inevitable britzel. So let's give a hand to everybody.